Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for being here. My name is Mary C. Murphy, and I'm a lecturer in politics in the Department of Government and Politics here in UCC. We're here today for the third in the Jean Monnet lecture series. We've previously had Dennis McShane, former UK Minister for Europe, and also Attain Tanham from Trinity College Dublin. But today I'm delighted to welcome Tony Connelly, the Europe editor, RTE Europe editor, to UCC for his second visit to the college. The last one was quite a few years ago. Tony has had a very long journey here today. He was on a bus from Derry at 10 to 6 this morning. So be gentle. Tony doesn't need any introduction, to be honest. You all know him. He's a very familiar figure. His book, however, Brexit and Ireland, The Dangers, the Opportunities and the Inside Story of the Irish Response, has been one of the most comprehensive and one of the most intriguing reads on Brexit and Ireland that I've certainly read. And Tony has just told me that the next edition of that book is due out in the next few weeks, updated to February of this year. So well worth a purchase, I think. Tony, as I said, is the Europe editor for RTE. And he's been working in Brussels for many years, but I think Brexit has really become his bread and butter over the last couple of years. He's also one of the top 5 news journalists on Twitter, as ranked by the Murray Tweet Index. He's here today to talk about the negotiations specifically, and the title is Brexit Negotiating the Negotiations. So sincere thanks, Tony, for making such a long trip here, and we very much look forward to your contribution.
Put this here, actually. Thank you very much, Mary. It's a great pleasure to be back in Cork. The last time I was here, Graham Norton got his honorary degree, so I don't know if that sort of registers the timeline of that. So I'm going to talk about the Brexit negotiations. I suppose a simple start would be, why do we need negotiations for Britain leaving the European Union? And it's often something you hear on BBC radio if they do vox pops in some of the big leave voting constituencies in the UK. People often say, you know, I thought we were out already. Like, why aren't we already out of the EU? Why do we need these negotiations? The reason is that Britain's a member and the negotiations are governed by Article 50 of the treaty, so Britain has to abide by that. And I think the key essence of Article 50 is that Brexit happens in the least disruptive way. So they want to avoid a disorderly exit. So that means Article 50 defines how Britain leaves. And it's the classic unscrambling the omelette, or taking the egg out of the omelette, that the Article 50 is trying to deal with. And from an Irish point of view, this is really key, because there are 3 key areas that have to be handled in the Article 50 negotiations, and one of them is Ireland, because the most disorderly part of Brexit is Ireland. There's no doubt about that. The potential for Brexit to upend and undermine the Good Friday Agreement is there for all to see. It is also a major economic disruption for Ireland, both in terms of north-south trade, also trade with the UK, and also trade between Ireland and the rest of the European Union, because 80% of exports that go to Europe use the UK as a land bridge. And if Britain is out of the customs union, then that has really serious implications. So how do we understand the term negotiations? Dean Acheson, who was Harry S. Truman's Secretary of State, described them as: negotiation in the classic diplomatic sense assumes that the parties are more anxious to agree than to disagree. And in the Article 50 negotiations, both sides are anxious to agree. The UK needs a free trade agreement with the EU. It needs to keep participating in EU agencies. It needs to keep participating in research, science and technology development. It needs to participate in the EU's aviational sphere. The EU in turn needs access to Britain's market. It needs access to Britain's heft in military and intelligence affairs. One anecdote that I came across was that when Russia invaded Crimea and Ukraine, when the EU was drawing up a list of sanctions against individuals, 70% of the names on that list came from British intelligence. So that is something that the EU will potentially lose when Brexit happens. So the UK wants something, the EU wants something, they negotiate and they meet in the middle. The problem is that the EU believes that what the UK wants, the UK already has. The EU believes that Britain effectively wants to leave the EU and then tunnel its way back in, hoping that on the way nobody notices that they don't want to abide by the obligations of membership or the obligations of access to the single market. The EU believes, in fact, that the UK is sacrificing so much, putting its economic welfare at risk for a glittering prize that dissolves at the point of contact. This, to me, is reflected in Albert Einstein's remark that sometimes you pay the most for the things that you get for nothing. So for other reasons, this is actually quite an odd negotiation. There's a huge mismatch in what both sides understand as what is up for negotiation. The EU believes that if it gave Britain the concessions that it wants on accessing the single market, the EU would actually negotiate itself out of existence. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I think we have to understand what the EU consists of and what the single market is all about. The single market has been painstakingly generated and built up over decades. It exists because of a million deals, compromises, regulations, directives that all other 28 member states, or all 28 member states, have over countless ministerial negotiations signed up to. And if the UK has the same access to that single market as it does at the moment, but without abiding by the rule book, without accepting the institutional framework, without accepting oversight, monitoring, and the adjudication of the European Court of Justice, then the single market would cease to exist in a meaningful way as it does at the moment. So in short, the EU believes that in fact the Britain wants single market and customs union light, but the EU believes that such a thing does not and cannot exist. So that is the essential contradiction as we enter these negotiations. So that I think these negotiations are not like any other negotiations in history, because there's such a mismatch between both sides' understanding of what is at stake. Now, according to the British view, the EU has been uncompromising from the start. Sometimes the target that Eurosceptics point to changes. When they complain that Britain is being punished, then it's the EU's fault as a whole. When they complain that the EU is being inflexible, then it's Michel Barnier's fault. It's the European Commission's fault. So then they think that Theresa May should appeal over his head to the heads of government directly. When Eurosceptics complain that others want to take advantage of Brexit at the UK's expense, then it's the member states' fault, most notably France. I think because of these differences in interpretation, and because of the fact that the EU is starting from a point that it is a treaty-based organisation that follows the rule of law, then some people describe this as a boxing match whereby the referee should have stopped the fight rounds ago, or shouldn't even have let the bout start. One by one, the UK has had to capitulate to the EU demands before the negotiations have really got underway. At a certain point, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, could say that the EU could go whistle if it expected the UK to pay a hefty exit bill. That has quietly been dropped, and the UK has signed up to an exit bill of about 40 billion plus. Other Eurosceptics say that if the UK accepted all the rules of the EU during the transition period, it would become a vassal state. But actually, the UK government has quietly accepted and signed up to all the rules and all the preconditions that the EU has set down in terms of the transition. So in a sense, the UK has had to scrap its opening negotiating positions at every turn. And this is understandable because Article 50 gives the advantage to the EU. That's the way it was written. It was written for that purpose. But the one area where the UK hasn't notably caved in, if you like, is the one which interests us. It's the Irish border. During the referendum campaign, the Good Friday Agreement barely featured, but it is an international treaty, and that's something that the EU kind of responds to. It appeals to the EU's erogenous zones, if you like. The EU, again, is a treaty-based organisation, so it looks at the Good Friday Agreement as an international treaty that it is desperate not to upset. There are two reasons why I think Ireland has managed to get its priorities and imperatives embedded in the EU negotiating mindset. And one is that they want to protect the Good Friday Agreement. They don't want to do anything which would trigger conflict. I think the EU is actually terrified of doing something or saying something that would reawaken the conflict. And for that reason, they take the Irish question very, very seriously. Now, I think the Irish government was aware of this in advance of the negotiations, and they took advantage of this. They realised that two things. One is that Ireland is remaining part of the 27, so it has a natural advantage over the UK. Secondly, the Irish government is aware of the EU's commitment to Ireland beforehand. In fact, the Irish peace process is one of the kind of conflict resolution episodes that the EU can actually look at and say, well, this is something that the EU helped and is something that the EU is proud of. Because if you look at conflict resolution attempts by the EU in its neighbourhood over the years, they have not been very successful. The EU was vilified at worst for its neglect of the Balkan conflict or its inability to prevent the Balkan conflict. It has been largely a passive bystander in the Middle East, in North Africa, and in Ukraine. I mean, the lead players and actors in those conflicts tend to be obviously Russia, France, Germany, the United States, and so on. So before the negotiations really got underway, the Irish government did its homework. It did a lot of outreach. I think going back to David Cameron's speech to Bloomberg in 2013, where the idea of a referendum was first presented, the very next day, the Irish Foreign Diplomatic Service was talking to its British counterparts about what this meant, what potentially might come down the tracks. And despite criticism that you get in Ireland, which is understandable that the Irish government haven't really been fully prepared or the civil service haven't been fully prepared, my understanding in researching the book was that the civil service did quite a lot of work ahead of the referendum. A lot more work, obviously, than the UK civil service did, which was zero. I mean, there was no preparation done by the British side whatsoever. So in order for Ireland to embed its priorities in the negotiations, it had to start drafting texts that the that the EU 27 would be able to accept. This was done through what they call the General Secretariat of the European Council. So these would be the people who work for Donald Tusk, and they were the ones who were going to be drafting the response to Article 50. So Theresa May would trigger Article 50 saying, okay, we're leaving. The EU would say, right, okay, we're going to start the negotiations, and here is our mandate. Here is the blueprint for how Michel Barnier is going to conduct these negotiations. So if Ireland wanted to be, front and centre in those negotiations, they had to get a paragraph into those negotiating guidelines, and they did that. So when the guidelines were adopted by the EU 27 at the end of April 2017, 1 month after Theresa May had triggered Article 50, the Irish clause was in there. It was paragraph 11, and I'll give you a little flavour of what it says. The EU supports the Good Friday Agreement in all its parts, and it will continue to support and protect the achievements, benefits and commitments of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, these might sound a bit like platitudes, but every word there has been fought over by the Irish government with the other member states and the European Commission. The Irish government call these the ABCs, the achievements, benefits and commitments, because the Irish government looks at the Good Friday Agreement in a very broad, expansive way. They look at it as almost a sacred text, which is not so much resolving the past, but is actually setting out the way Ireland progresses in the future. So they want to kind of future-proof the Good Friday Agreement from Brexit, and to make sure that any changes to the relationship between Britain and the EU do not damage the Good Friday Agreement as it progresses into the future. Now, this paragraph 11, as we recall, has these magical words that are used over and over again. They talk about the unique circumstances of Ireland. They talk about the need for flexible and imaginative solutions. These have almost become cliches, in fact, in the negotiations, but they're very important. But just to show you that, in a sense, while the Irish were able to successfully embed the Irish question into this process, there was a bit of pushback from the other member states and from the European Council. They were effectively saying out to Ireland, look, we know this is going to be very damaging for your country. We know the risks. We know the history and the vulnerability of the peace process. But we cannot promise that the world will not change, because the world will change because of Brexit. And it will change in Ireland more than any other country. So Ireland wanted to have this paragraph 11 saying that the EU will prevent a hard border on the island of Ireland. And the European Council said, we can't say that. So if you look at the actual wording, it is, we will use flexible and imaginative solutions with the aim of preventing a hard border. And those words were like fought over for 2 weeks, with the aim of. The Irish were obviously pushing for a much more explicit commitment from the European Union. The EU were saying, we can't, because we can't promise you that the sky won't fall when Brexit happens. But there were other notable, I think, successes from an Irish point of view, if you like. The whole question about a united Ireland, and if in the future, if there's a united Ireland, then Northern Ireland will automatically be part of the European Union. Now, a lot of people have been a little bit dismissive of that phrase or that achievement in the negotiations, but actually none of these are given, and the EU is very allergic to upsetting any sovereignty issues in other parts of the European Union. What the Irish government did was they said, okay, look, let's go back to Germany. When Germany was reunified at the end of the 80s, East Germany was automatically brought into the European Union. Now, this, again, was not a given, because the criteria that countries have to pass to be able to enter the European Union, to join the European Union, are quite strict in terms of their economies, the way their legal systems work. And East Germany did not qualify. But because of various bits of fancy footwork done by the Irish government at the time, because Ireland had the presidency of the EU, there was a way of getting East Germany to be automatically spirited into the European Union. And this is what the Irish government have achieved on this occasion with this unity clause in the negotiating guidelines. The morning that clause was adopted by the 27 member states, there was a problem. The French government looked at this idea about Northern Ireland automatically being part of the EU if there was a united Ireland, and the French, being quite legalistic as they are, said, hang on a second, does this mean that the EU is somehow going to be instrumental in bringing about a united Ireland? Because that's not necessarily what we are prepared to go for. And again, what I find fascinating about this process is the weight of individual words in the negotiations. There was a scrambled meeting that morning between the Irish ambassador to the EU, the French ambassador, and the Secretary General of the European Council, and they met, and the Irish government pointed to a word, and that word was such. And the unity clause that was agreed that morning said, the Good Friday Agreement, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, provides for a consent clause, and if that clause is triggered and there is a referendum on unity, such a united Ireland would automatically be part of the European Union. So that word such was, this is the word the Irish government and their lawyers all huddled over and said, look, is the word such is in there. That means it's only in those circumstances, and it's only related to the Good Friday Agreement, which has the famous consent clause. So this is just to give you a sense of what the Irish government has done so far, but also the pushback that they have had. I mean, I think there's a sense that we hear that the European Union is united behind Ireland, but it hasn't been plain sailing, and there has been pushback on occasion. Now, I'll bring you back now to last summer. The negotiations got underway in June. The night before the negotiations, the Irish told the British negotiating team, we're not going to be part of this negotiating process. The Irish question will be dealt with separately. And the British were like astonished, saying, how can you possibly not have the Irish question and the border question in this process that we're now starting? And the reason was that the process that was starting in June of last year was essentially a technical process. They were looking at, first of all, the financial settlement that Britain would have to pay when it leaves the European Union. It was looking at the question of citizens' rights in EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the rest of Europe. And to get those issues solved was a technical exercise. I mean, how much does Britain owe? What is it paying for? What rights do citizens have? How do we enshrine these rights? The Irish border issue, according to the Irish government, was exclusively a political question. And you often heard this last year with Leo Varadkar and Enda Kenny before him saying, we're not getting into a technical solution, this is a political process. And you'll remember that the revenue commissioners had done this huge scoping exercise looking at Norway, Sweden, possible high-tech borders, seamless border crossings, and basically they were told to stand down that exercise, saying, okay, guys, you're independent, but you're not doing that technical exercise because we do not want to gift wrap a technical solution for the United Kingdom. So from the very beginning, there was again a disconnect between what the British government believed the negotiations were about and what the Irish government believed the negotiations were about. So what happened was there was a separate strand to the negotiations. It was called a kind of a high-level political dialogue by the coordinators. Now that is Ollie Robbins on the British side. He's the chief European advisor for Theresa May, and Sabina Viand, who is the deputy negotiator for Michel Barnier. So they are handling the Irish border issues separately as a political question. Now the first thing that happened was in the summer, in July, the Irish government said to the Commission, this is the task force, this is Michel Barnier's team, would you go and ask Britain what they mean by protecting the Good Friday Agreement? And the Commission said, yeah, okay, we'll ask them. So they went off to the British and said, what do you mean by protecting the Good Friday Agreement? And the British said, we don't really know. So the Commission sent the British government off to think about what it meant about protecting the Good Friday Agreement, to think about what North-South cooperation meant. So that off they went in last summer, July and August. In August, the British produced two papers, one paper on Ireland and another paper on the future customs arrangements. Then in September, the EU task force produced its first paper on Ireland. And it was quite interesting. The British paper on Ireland was 28 pages long. It was full of kind of diagnosing the problem, first of all. It was quite descriptive, saying this is the problem that Ireland and the UK faces with the border, with the transit issue in the UK, the agri-food products crossing the border, and it had loads of technical fixes and solutions, like using cameras that can read number plates, having trusted trader schemes where if you're a big enough trader, then you have a kind of at the start of the year you have a pro forma customs declaration that is all done in advance, and then the task force, Michel Barnier's task force, kind of brought out its riposte to this paper, and it was 6 pages long. And people are going, what's going on here? Britain is clearly coming up with technical solutions, and the task force is saying, well, we're sticking to principles here. But again, this was the Irish government's strategy. We're not getting into the technology of it. We are starting with principles, and those principles have an ask. Okay, so for the first time in September last year, the task force kind of articulated what the Irish border question was about. It wasn't just about trade across the border. It was about the Good Friday Agreement in its holistic potential, and that was not just an all-island economy. It was societal. It was reconciliation. It was again this kind of slightly sacred devotion to a particular way of reading the Good Friday Agreement. Now the UK said, absolutely, we'll sign up to the 6 principles or the 7 principles in this paper. But the Irish response to that reminds me of Otto von Bismarck's quote, where he says, when a man approves of something in principle, it means he hasn't the slightest intention of putting it into practice. And that exactly was the Irish government's belief, that Britain was saying, where do we sign? But they didn't realise that there was an ask from these principles. And when everybody did realise was a key date, and to me this will be like one of the historic dates in the whole Brexit process, November the 8th last year, there was an internal working paper leaked from the Michel Barnier's task force. It had 7 bullet points on Ireland. The first 2 or 3 bullet points were about the common travel area, saying how much progress had been made on that. Then the other bullet points talked about the mapping process that was underway. Now remember I mentioned that the British government was sent off to explore what it meant by the Good Friday Agreement, protecting the Good Friday Agreement, what it meant by preserving North-South cooperation. The British government went off and they looked at all the areas of North-South cooperation. So they drafted in civil servants from London and from Belfast, and they come up with a figure of 142 areas where there is North-South cooperation. And what happened then in September was the European Commission task force and Irish officials got together in Brussels in a big room with British officials, and then later officials from Belfast, Northern Ireland Executive and the Northern Ireland Office, and they looked at these 142 areas of North-South cooperation, and they looked at each one in detail to see where does EU law collide with these 142 areas. And I mean, this was actually a very historic, I think, turning point in this process, because you look at the Good Friday Agreement and you say, okay, there's 6 or 7 headline areas of cross-border cooperation, but when you drill down into how those areas of cooperation actually work on the ground, how they work on a day-to-day level, you will find that they are kind of facilitated or enhanced or enabled by the fact that both sides share the same legal system. They share EU law. So take the health sphere, for example. You have somebody has a heart attack in Letterkenny, they can go to Derry, to Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry for specialised treatment. If there's a child in Belfast who has cancer, they can go to Dublin for specialised treatment in Crumlin. But all of that specialised treatment is actually enhanced by the fact that they share the same rules of medical devices, of medicine, of the qualifications of medical personnel, medical professionals are recognised on both sides of the border because of EU law. If you wrench EU law away from that equation, then none of that's really going to work in the same way. It's going to be complicated and it's going to be disrupted. And then we get back to the reason we have Article 50, which is to avoid disruption. So within a few weeks, this process of examining the 142 areas, it became clear very quickly that you need a broad solution to this. So when the British negotiators looked at these 7 bullet points in this working paper that was leaked on the 8th of November, they looked at the last one, and the last one said, it seems essential that in order to guarantee no hard border, there will have to be no regulatory divergence on either side of the border on the rules of the single market and customs union. And of course, the British were astounded by this, because this was the first time that we had this whole idea of Northern Ireland remaining in the customs union and single market. So what this bullet point said was, okay, for all this mapping stuff that we're doing, to avoid any disruption in that, we need to keep Northern Ireland in the single market effectively. To avoid any border issue, like for trade and goods, you need to have Northern Ireland in the customs union. And the task force is saying, like, it's essential. You know, it seems to us that there's no other way around this. Now, the next day, David Davis was at a press conference in Brussels, and he said this effectively would undermine the constitutional arrangements of Northern Ireland. It would place a barrier on the Irish Sea, and it's not acceptable. Now, the Irish government and Irish officials were furious at that, because to them, the British side knew this all along. They had actually embarked on this mapping exercise. What else did they expect? There was no other way of dealing with this, according to the Irish analysis of this, and they felt that the British response was entirely disingenuous, and there was absolute fury in the Irish side. So they organised a meeting on the 15th of November to clear the air, and it didn't actually work. And then about a week later, maybe at the end of that week, Theresa May met Leo Varadkar in Gothenburg. There was an EU summit in Gothenburg, and that was the lowest point, I think, in relations. There was an extremely difficult meeting, and you can see if you ever get a chance to look back at the TV report, they were in a very small room on the margins of this summit in Gothenburg, on a tiny table. I think their knees must have even been touching, and they both looked extremely uncomfortable. And when they came out, Theresa May said something like, "We're both on the same page. We both want the same outcomes." But the Irish government were furious, because they said, "We're not on the same page at all. The British government do not get it. They do not get that. In order to avoid a hard border, which is what you say you want, you have to actually get out of your comfort zone as far as unionism is concerned, and at least engage with the idea of Northern Ireland staying in the customs union and single market." So what happened next then was, of course, none of this could progress for Britain until these issues were sorted. So just to refresh your memory, at the end of last year, Britain was desperate to get into phase 2 of the negotiations, because they needed to get into the trade negotiations. But of course, the rules according to Article 50 were that you can't do that until you sort out the Irish border, the financial settlement, and citizens' rights. And it was clear that progress was being made in the financial settlement. I mean, the British side were lowering their red lines all the time and saying, okay, we'll pay this amount, we'll pay 20 billion, and of course it went up to 40 billion. And on citizens' rights, that was all being resolved as well. And suddenly the Irish question was being the big question that the people had kind of disregarded for months, apart from those of you who bought my book, obviously. So it was actually quite exciting last year, because we were heading towards a showdown in December. Britain would not get into phase 2 of the negotiations unless they grappled with this Irish nettle of embracing the single market and customs union for Northern Ireland. So the negotiations on how to find a set of words to reflect that began on the 30th of November of last year. Now, the choreography of this, if you recall, was that Jean-Claude Juncker was going to meet Theresa May in Brussels for lunch. They were going to sign off on the deal, and then 2 weeks later, the heads of government would come along and say, right, we accept Britain's made sufficient progress on these 3 areas. We can now go ahead in phase 2. So everything had to be agreed on the 4th of December. On the 30th of November, Irish and British and EU officials got into a room to start the negotiations on how they would do this. And the British were still resisting any idea that Northern Ireland would still be in the customs union and single market. And they, of course, were saying, no, we will solve the problem by having a broad free trade agreement with the EU in the future, or we will solve it by having these technical solutions, which the EU had kind of rejected as magical thinking. These are the kind of unicorn spaceships you may have heard about, floating over the border. That's a slightly pejorative way of putting it, obviously, but that was the kind of flack that was attracting at the time. An interesting thing happened, which hasn't been reported on, is that when that meeting started on the 30th of November, the Irish government said, okay, I'll tell you what, you can have your free trade idea and your technical solutions idea, as well as what became known as the backstop, the idea of Northern Ireland staying in the customs union. So the Irish government actually made quite a risky concession up front. They said, okay, we'll have all three options in there. Now they've been called, now they're called option A, B and C. A, again, just to remind you, A is that the future trade agreement between the EU and the UK will be so brilliant and so deep and so comprehensive that there will be no need for a border between North and South. Option B is the technical solutions, the trusted traders, the license plate scanning cameras and so on. And option C, of course, is the Irish government's backstop, saying, okay, if none of those options work, then option C will be the backstop. Northern Ireland will remain largely in the customs union and single market. So this was kind of grappled over that weekend, and the phrase they were using, of course, was there would be no regulatory divergence. Okay, what does that mean? It means that things would kind of stay the same north and south of the border. Northern Ireland would still abide by the customs union rules, so you wouldn't have to have customs checks. They would still abide by the single market, largely. Theresa May was really not happy with this because she knew, of course, that she couldn't get this past the unionists, and she was dependent on the DUP for survival. So on the Sunday night, like the night before the lunch, the Irish government agreed to a change in the kind of syntax or the semantics of the text. And they said, okay, instead of no regulatory divergence, we will have continued regulatory alignment. Now, to most people, like me included, this is like dancing on the head of a pin. Like, you know, what's the difference? The key difference is that alignment to British ears is a voluntary act. It's saying we, as the United Kingdom, will align ourselves with the EU rulebook. No regulatory divergence, on the other hand, means that you're kind of you're binding yourself to a straight line, that you're not going to step away from this line. So to British sensitivities, this was a bridge too far. They would prefer to say, okay, we will sort of step up to the EU rulebook, and we will. I mean, it's been described as train tracks. Okay, they're not one line; it's train tracks. Okay. So that was easier for the British government to swallow, and the Irish government said, okay, I'll tell you what, we'll seek legal advice, and the Irish government did. They went to the Attorney General, and they discovered that the term alignment is actually quite well established in international law. If a country wants to join the EU, it has to align its legislation with the EU rulebook. So the Irish government felt, well, actually, this is okay, we can live with this. The trouble is that a country joining the EU is converging with the EU rulebook. Britain is leaving the EU, so it's actually going in the opposite direction. Anyway, that was an observation. The deal was done. That morning, before the lunch happened, there was an extraordinary cabinet meeting in Dublin where Leo Varadkar explained the meaning of these phrases and what was on offer. And I actually, in Brussels, had been trying to work sources that morning, and I got a source to confirm to me that this key paragraph about no regulatory divergence. I got a second source on that, and they said, yeah, that's what's in the text. But then she came back and said, actually, it's been changed to continued regulatory alignment. Now, at that stage, I couldn't really see the difference, but to me, the key thing was that from a point in early November, when the UK had gone nuts when they heard this idea that Northern Ireland would stay in the customs union, they had now, it looked like they were actually accepting the idea. So to me, this was a kind of a concession, and the sources I spoke to as well said, this is a huge concession by Britain, look what they're signing up to. So RTE actually broke the story before the launch happened, and I put a few things out on Twitter, and the DUP were that moment in number 9 Downing Street going through the text with the Chief of Staff of Theresa May. Can't remember his name for the moment, but the DUP were going through the text when they saw my tweet. And I said, hang on a second, this is not what we signed up for. This is not our understanding of what this means. Now, the thing is, at that stage, nobody knew the full extent of the text, and nobody knew really that this backstop idea, or option C, was going to be like a kind of default. If the other two options don't work, then this will kick in. But I mean, as a journalist, this was a kind of tricky moment for me. But you know, journalists have to report what they know. They can't second guess the wider context. As long as you report it, I suppose, carefully and responsibly. And the way we reported it was, the UK is prepared to accept no regulatory divergence according to a draft seen by RTE News. And then the second paragraph after that was, it's not clear if both governments have agreed to this, but this is part of a draft that RTE has seen. So we were saying, look, we don't know the final outcome, but this is in the draft. And actually the draft had stayed intact all that weekend. So anyway, the unionists were spooked, and they ran out down the steps in Stormont and said, we're not accepting this. And you know, I was personally accused of having destroyed the agreement, and having spooked the DUP horses. Anyway, that was the kind of environment at the time and the atmosphere. But what happened was that the negotiators got back around the phones, and they more or less produced the same agreement. But there was this extra paragraph, paragraph 50, which said there won't be any barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK as a result of this. So what happened next? Well, Britain then got the go-ahead to enter phase 2, and then the negotiating guidelines were updated. There was a what they call an anti-backsliding clause in there. There was a warning in there that Britain could not, you know, resile or retreat from the commitment it had just made in this joint report. But then the EU basically had to start drafting the withdrawal treaty. Now, let's go back to what I said at the beginning. Why do we need negotiations? We need negotiations because there has to be a treaty that guides Britain out of the EU. And this treaty has to be ready by October because it needs to be ratified. And so the EU had to start drafting this treaty, and it was being drafted in a fairly feverish atmosphere because everybody knew the political backdrop to this. British officials weren't part of the drafting, obviously, but they knew what way the drafting was going. And they kept saying, Ollie Robbins kept saying, look what's happening in Belfast. The DUP are not going to like this. You know, the assembly has collapsed. It hasn't been reactivated. You know, be careful what you do here. I mean, the British were basically at every stage trying to limit or kill off this idea of Northern Ireland staying in the customs union and single market. And the Irish government was saying, no, it has to stay in there. So the British were putting up taboos, and the Irish were saying, no, you can't have those taboos. And the Europeans were in the middle going, these crazy Irish and British, what are they doing to us? But anyway, at the end of February, the draft treaty was, or the first draft of this treaty was published. And this was gone over for weeks by officials, by the legal services in the European Commission and the European Council and the task force. And they tried to present this thing in as technocratic style as possible. It was a very dry kind of, this is a treaty, so it's like 130 pages. But even though they tried to make this as kind of technocratic and dry as possible, there were phrases that jumped out at you. Northern Ireland would be considered part of the territory of the customs union. I mean, the word territory alone, you can just see how that would be a red rag to unionism. There would be a common regulatory area on the island of Ireland governing goods. So there'd be no restrictions on goods. And basically, if you think about it, this is saying, okay, you want no hard border, this is how you do it. And this is the legal text that will make that operational. Operationalizing is the word that they use. Of course, the British went bananas. Theresa May went into the House of Commons saying no British government could ever accept this. And there was a crisis yet again. Now, what happened since then was kind of politics, I guess. The Irish government was saying, okay, we were expecting this, but they found it again nonsensical that the British didn't expect this, because this was basically giving legal effect to the deal that the British had signed up to in December. Now, once you put it down in stark legal language, it looks frightening, and of course, the DUP couldn't abide it. But the key thing then was that there's always this pressure from the other side that Britain can't move forward unless it abides by its commitments. And the moving forward bit that Britain needed, of course, was the transition. Because the British business sector, the CBI, are begging Theresa May to agree a transition so that nothing happens that's different at the end of March next year. There'll be a 2-year period where everything stays the same. But Britain couldn't get this transition unless the other 27 agree to it. So in a sense, in February, March, the Irish government had the potential to say, okay, we're not agreeing this transition until Britain actually agrees this legal text. But this was a bit of a tricky time for the Irish government because of all countries, Ireland also needs the transition. Because think of all the beef farmers and dairy producers and fishing organisations. They need things to stay the same at the end of March next year. So the Irish government didn't necessarily want to be the party that blows up the transition. So there were again intense negotiations, and eventually they got the British side to commit to the December agreement. So Theresa May wrote a letter to Donald Tusk saying that she would abide by all of the elements of the December joint report, including the backstop. And just before the March summit, which approved the transition, the latest draft of the withdrawal agreement was published. It was done and actually color-coded, so anything in green was stuff that's agreed, anything in yellow was, okay, the outcomes are agreed, but the technical aspects of how to get there haven't been agreed. Anything in white was just simply not agreed. And the whole Irish protocol was not agreed, obviously. But front and centre at the start of that draft treaty was a paragraph saying basically Britain has to abide by the promises in December. So when they had those two things, the Irish government could say, okay, right, we can now accept that the transition goes ahead, that we now start the process towards the future trade agreement. And again, the crisis was averted. But of course, that caused a lot of unease in Ireland because Fianna Fáil said, look, Britain's getting away with murder here. I mean, we had this promise in December. They backslid from that. They're now saying they're not going to accept it. And I think the bilateral or the kind of bipartisan approach to Brexit has fractured because of this. So I'll bring things to a close and then take questions, but just to kind of point out where things are going to go from here. Over the next 6 weeks, there are going to be intense negotiations between the EU task force and Britain over the Irish protocol and the Irish issue. Now, the common travel area has been more or less agreed. One issue that's coming up that is proving to be a lot trickier, I think, than people realised is the question of human rights in Northern Ireland. There are rights that are enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement that are reflected in EU rights and fundamental rights. And these are tricky because you would have a scenario where you have to create a mechanism that gives people in Northern Ireland protection under those rights, but people in the rest of the UK wouldn't have those protections. So it's proving difficult. The other problem is that Britain has kind of got out of jail in a sense with this Irish protocol. Okay, Theresa May has written a letter. She's promised X, Y, and Z to Donald Tusk, and we have this box at the beginning of the withdrawal treaty. But we are now in the realm of the future trade talks. Okay. And to the UK negotiators that I've spoken to, they think this changes everything. So all the stuff about technical solutions and a future free trade agreement solving the border like magic, they say, well, we couldn't really get into those before because we were all in phase 1, but now we're fully in phase 2, so we can actually start talking about these flexible and imaginative solutions. But you see, the problem again is that the flexible and imaginative solutions for Britain are completely different from the flexible and imaginative solutions as envisaged by the EU and by Ireland. So we now have the next rendezvous, which is June, the June summit. And there is language in the last summit that says Britain will have to abide by its commitments by June. If there's no agreement in June, then it gets into October. And as I said before, October is the ultimate deadline, really. And it might drift into November or December even, but I mean, Britain is leaving the EU at the end of March next year, so this has to be sorted. And the problem for Ireland is in these negotiations that if it doesn't get agreed in June, if this backstop isn't given hard and fast legal effect, then it drifts into October, and then you get a pressure cooker situation. And we know from negotiations, if we talk about negotiating the negotiations, that's what you want to avoid in negotiations. You want to avoid a pressure cooker where you suddenly have to drop your red lines, and the Irish government may be forced into abandoning its devotion to the backstop. So that's the scenario we're in at the moment, and that's where I'll leave it, and I'll be happy to take questions from here on in.